This week on week 13, we're going to talk about nationalism and Asia. And when I say Asia, I'm not talking about just the Far East. I'm not talking about Central Asia. I'm talking about most of Asia. And we're going to choose three examples for you to look at. We're going to look at Turkey, we're going to look at Japan, and we're going to look at India. Now, these three are not necessarily related to each other, but they do provide a broader picture of the anti-colonial movement and the nationalist movements that are rising up in Asia in no small part as a response to the events of World War I. So let me start off with a few questions for you. So on your recollection, what Asian countries participated in any way in World War I? If you said Japan, China, India, the Arabian Peninsula, any of those, or even all of those, you're absolutely correct. Japan helped as a kind of ancillary partner in the Pacific, sent hospital ships during World War I. China worked for various powers, for bits and pieces here and there, depending on the sphere of influence, mostly as mechanics, as laborers, that sort of thing. India was also very useful and helpful in fighting in World War I. And of course, the Arab Peninsula was one of the focuses of fighting against the Ottoman Empire. So after all of this is happening, um, we talked about how they came to the aid of the Allies, right? So how many came to the aid of the Central Powers other than Ottoman Turkey? None of them. None of them at all ever came to the aid of Germany or Austria-Hungary. So if they were integral to the fighting in the European theater, in securing peace in the Pacific, and ensuring the instability of the Ottoman Empire, how would they have been treated after the war? If you said, well, they should be treated equally and fairly and justly, yeah, I would love to live in your world. Unfortunately, the reality was India suffered under martial law during World War I, and that martial law was continued well after the end of hostilities in World War I, and that martial law became increasingly brutal, and it was largely driven by a fear of rebellion. Remember that for England, most of its treasury was depleted. It was almost broke. It was living on loans from the United States and others, and it needed to really recoup a lot of its losses. Losing the Indian subcontinent would have been an incredible financial blow to the English Empire, one which may have precipitated its disintegration. It had already seen the Austro-Hungarians disintegrated. It had seen the Ottomans disintegrated. It had seen the Russians disintegrated because of World War I, and that was not a path that they were willing to go down. So India was treated poorly. Japan also was treated poorly. Japan was treated as a minor partner. It was given a few bits and pieces of Asia, largely because the Europeans couldn't afford to dislodge them from any contested claims, and it was just easier to give them that territory or let them administer that territory than to fight over it. It would have been a foolish endeavor. On top of it, that wasn't just because Japan was so strong, but it was also because honestly, there was a lot of discrimination. We are talking about a very racist worldview for most people living in the early 1900s. So there was a lot of discrimination against the Japanese, and we'll see that played out in the lecture as we move forward. And then finally, China was also exploited and abused throughout the entire process. They were exploited for their labor. Doctors were used, laborers were used. They often suffered the same effects that combatants did, but they didn't receive the same recognition, as limited as that was, as the combatants did as well. So they were exploited for their resources, exploited for their people, and largely abused. So how does that leave them feeling? Now let's talk about terms. Now, first, When we talk about the Middle East, we're going to talk about mandates. Now, mandates are not unique to the Middle East, but they are played out most plainly in the Middle East. And essentially, a mandate was a representative body called the League of Nations that was proposed by the United States, yet never really joined by the United States, a precursor to the United Nations. Now, the League of Nations decreed that the former territories of the Ottoman Empire needed to be administered by the victors of World War I, that is France and Britain. Surprise, surprise there. Ostensibly, this is going to sound familiar. It is to teach the people in the Middle East how to govern themselves, essentially bringing civilization, integrating them into the world commerce. And of course, if they happen, some of them happen to be Christian, so that's kind of a good thing, but not as much proselytizing as there was in previous centuries. So it sounds rather familiar. Of course it does. As much as people would like things to go back to the way that they were and pretend that World War I did not happen. Tectonic events, despite your desire to stick your head in the sand, will not be ignored. And so France and Britain utilized this mandate to essentially enrich themselves. France a little bit more so than Britain, but Britain was by no means an innocent angel, especially when it comes to the extraction of things like oil. And in the meantime, they utilized this concept of divide and rule, of setting sectarian groups and ethnic groups and linguistic groups against each other in order to distract them while resources were being extracted. It is a age-old tactic, and it works in a myriad of settings. Next is satyagraha. It is an Indian word, well, a Hindi word, which loosely translates into the spirit force, or essentially a moral superiority. Satyagraha is essentially willingness to take abuse in the face of monstrosity in order to prove to the person who is doing the abusing that they are morally bankrupt. This is not a uniquely Indian concept. In the Bible, we have this concept of turning the other cheek, and that if somebody sues you for your cloak, give him your tunic as well. Don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing, that sort of thing. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, that sort of thing. So it's this idea of you do not respond to violence with violence, because once you respond with violence, you become the bad person. You become the aggressor, especially when we're talking about a disparity in power. For example, if you are being questioned by the police and you are hit, struck, slapped, punched by a police officer. If you punch back, I guarantee anybody who's filming the scene will say, well, look, this guy was a violent person or this woman was a violent person. They had it what's coming. The cop was just defending himself. However, if you are covering up and taking their blows and not fighting back, it really looks like the police is abusing their power. And that's essentially what's happening in India. The more that the police beat on the protesters, these nonviolent protesters, the more morally bankrupt the police seem. And this is a concept that is utilized in the American civil rights movement. The marches, which were against the law, do not mistake protesting with being law abiding. Protests from day one of human existence have always had to break the law. America was founded on protests that broke the law. The Boston Tea Party broke the law. And the Boston Massacre, it was a gathering of Americans protesting tax collection. They may have thrown rocks. Throwing rocks at the police, that's breaking the law. So therefore, you break the law in order to provoke a reaction. And that is true in India. It is true in the American Civil Rights Movement. It is true with any movement. You break the law because the law is unjust. You cannot comply with an unjust law, and therefore you provoke a reaction from the police. The police act with brutality, and yes, you morally win. Then finally, we're going to move on to the Zaibatsu. Zaibatsu is nothing to do with politics and all to do with economics. Zaibatsu is essentially a monopoly. It's a dictated monopoly that promotes ultranationalism, militarism, and a kind of pseudo-fascism in Japan. Essentially, what it reintroduces is a feudal concept that companies, not necessarily lords or uh, aristocracy, have a responsibility to keep control of a certain portion of population. So it's the businesses, it's the companies that have that are able to control almost every aspect of a worker's life. There is still that kind of sense of zaibatsu in Japan now, in that if you work for a company, you represent that company 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Uh, and that all started in the 1920s and 1930s as the military really eats away at the democracy of Japan and enacts a kind of quiet coup in Japan. So the military is increasingly powerful, and they work to undercut uh, the emperor's power, the emperor's influence over Japan. Notice the emperor was in charge, but then suddenly he becomes a figurehead again. This kind of resurgence of this samurai ethos in the military, this worshiping of the samurai, or at least the ideals of the samurai, that warriors should be put top in Japan's society. That's where Japan's society is most natural. And of course, suspicious of things like democracy, liberalism, open economic opportunities. So it was a very what we call a corporatist structure. In other words, the military or the government relies on corporations to keep the population in control, to control their movement, their education, their livelihood, and to keep them pacified. And in return, the corporations get very generous concessions from the government in the form of kind of quasi-monopolies. Now we're moving on to the Middle East. Now, the Middle East was a very important front on the First World War because it provided a distraction for the Ottoman Empire. It's very difficult to fight wars on multiple fronts. The Ottoman Empire had to fight a multi-front war. So did the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans. One of the reasons why the Central Powers lost is it's very difficult to split your resources on two wildly divergent or three wildly divergent frontiers. If you can bog the enemy down in one direction, that's great. If you could probably push and maybe break through their lines and shatter their defenses, that's fantastic. But if you have to fight on multiple fronts, it's much harder to do that. So before World War I had ended, France and Britain had gotten together and decided that they were going to divide up the old Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was not going to last much longer, and so during World War One, the French and British negotiators, the liaisons to each other, had basically drawn up a kind of map of their own, based not on geography, not on linguistic boundaries, not on anything that is relevant to anybody living in the region, but rather a line on a map. They basically took a map and drew a line across it and said, okay, this part is for France, this part is for England, and we will administer them after the war is over. Now, the um, the problem with that, of course, is that it ignores some of the tensions that this may create. It also tends to put people on two sides of a different line uh, that may have been unified at one point, that may have a cultural similarity. They also, in that agreement, the French and the British decide that they're going to favor certain groups within these zones. For example, the French really favored Christians that were living in Syria and Lebanon. The idea was that they were very much similar to the French Catholic faith. They were also very similar in ideas and ideologies, and so therefore we're going to favor them. And the same thing is true in what would later be known as Iraq. Um, that the British favored certain ethnic groups within Iraq. That will come back to haunt the poor people in Iraq and in Lebanon, Syria in a later date. Unfortunately, the British or French really don't suffer any of these favorite the backlash of any of these favoritism policies. And then on top of it, in order to kind of legitimize their claims, the British and French claims on this territory, they announced these grandiose plans for the region once the war is over and once the Ottoman Empire is defeated. Sometimes these promises have um, multiple different audiences, and sometimes they seem to contradict each other. I'll give you an example in just a moment. The perfect example is the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. All right. So the Balfour Declaration was something made by the British government that was intended to court the Jewish people living in not only Germany, but also in the United States. And the idea was that England, once it is victorious, will set aside land in what would have been historically Judea and set up a land for a national home for Jews to live there. It was a very transparent ploy to appeal to Jewish nationalism, which had really begun to kind of gain a kind of fringe popularity in the 1880s and 1890s, had been talked about in the early 1900s, never really enacted on. Now suddenly, in a pang of consciousness and in the deep well of British generosity, they suddenly find it within themselves to promise somebody else's land to the Jewish people as long as they understood that it was only predicated on an English victory. The English would then administer and protect a fledgling Jewish home. And the idea was that these Jews would finally be able to come home. It barely mentions in the Balfour Declaration that there were actually people already living there. It was painted as kind of an empty land that had been bereft of people for thousands of years. The reality was, for about 1900 years, there had been a lot of people living there. And in fact, there were very vibrant communities who had lived there even before those 1900 years. Judea was not a monolithic region in which only Jews lived. It's absolutely historically, that's absolutely ahistorical. That is absolutely not what really happened. But that ignores it. It paints a pretty picture of a fertile land waiting for the return of its historical people. And that's a narrative that still continues to this day. There are many in this what's known as a Zionist movement who said that this land was wasted, it was fallow, it was empty, and it wasn't until the Jews came back and founded Israel that it actually found prosperity. That is not true. It was, yes, underdeveloped. It absolutely was. It was, yes, largely neglected by a crumbling Ottoman Empire, but it wasn't that it was empty or that it wasn't fertile or that it wasn't being worked or that the people who lived there didn't have a legitimate claim. So speaking of that legitimate claim, we have something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, again made by the British government around the same time that the Balfour Declaration is being made. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is aimed at Arabs living in the Middle East, particularly in the Arab Peninsula, but also in an ancillary to what would later be known as Israel, what we will refer to as the Levant. Now, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is an agreement with the Arabs to divide what would later be known as Palestine between the French and the Arabs, and they would set up a kind of protective regime that would allow Arabs from the peninsula to establish kingships in the Middle East, particularly in what was known as Transjordan at the time. What they referred to as Transjordan was the modern state of Jordan, as well as Palestine and what would now be known as Israel. So a country that spans the Jordan River. It would have access to the Mediterranean, but it would be mostly an interior territory. So the idea was we'll get the Arabs on board. The Arabs will fight on our behalf against the Ottoman Empire, and we will give them the same land that we had promised the Jews, right? And it was an entirely cynical ploy that was largely transparent. It wasn't like the British really had a claim on that territory. They kind of did through agreements in the 19th century. They had a lot of influence in that region. They had a lot of economic interests, and of course, they were one of the major powers. And it seemed like they were winning, but they needed a little bit more help, a little bit more pressure put on the Ottoman Empire, and the Arabs were more than happy to respond. So we have these two competing agreements, especially when it comes to what would later be known as Israel, what we can call the Levant, what may have been called in the past Judea. So you have the same land on the eastern part of the Mediterranean that is promised to Jews and has no mention of Arabs. That's also promised to Arabs and has almost no mention of Jews. So how do you reconcile those two? Well, the reality is they couldn't. In the meantime, although the Ottoman Empire does collapse, the military of the Ottoman Empire is still out there resisting the French and British attempts to occupy its land. The idea was that chunks of land would be divvied up amongst the Allies once Russia withdrew from the war after the revolution of 1917. France and England were like, well, great, more for us. We'll go ahead and divvy it up. We'll send troops over there. The only problem is by 1918, there really were not a lot of troops to be sent over there. And England and France really didn't have the wherewithal to push too much against the Ottoman military. So the Ottoman military was still resisting occupation, and they forced a peace accord on their own terms. We talked a little bit last week about the Treaty at Versailles, that was basically strong arming the German government into agreeing to odious concessions and basically starving the people out until they agreed to this lopsided treaty. The opposite happens with the Ottoman Empire, thanks in no small part to this individual here, Mustafa Kemal. Uh, Kemal Mustafa Ataturk, sorry, Mustafa Kemal, I'm sorry, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who really wrung a lot of concessions from the British and the French because they were exhausted. Those troops were exhausted. They couldn't afford to fight anymore. For example, if this had happened in Germany, maybe we would have had a completely different Treaty of Versailles. Maybe, but it didn't. So the Germans are saddled with a very lopsided agreement. The Ottomans, or former Ottomans, now the Turkish state, is in a more advantageous footing. So Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, as the kind of commander-in-chief of the newly victorious Turkish army, he was by no means a shoe-in for that title. He during the resistance, he had to kind of absorb smaller or maybe rival units that were also trying to fight, so they had common cause. He united them. He was very charismatic. He was very forceful in personality. He was also a hero of one of the few victories of Ottoman resistance against the Allies. And so he had the cachet to basically make himself the commander in chief and then eventually the president of the new Turkish state. Under his guidance, he creates this new um, national philosophy called Kemalism. Now, Kemal comes from the Turkish word meaning perfect. So this is perfectionism, essentially, and it's a roadmap for a new secular Turkish state, and modeled on this idea of a uh, representative republic, and it was very much cast as a kind of new, modern, chic, powerful state. It was very Western looking. They changed um, their writing from an Arabic influenced writing to a more Cyrillic influenced writing. That's why Turkish looks very almost familiar, especially if you've ever read anything that is in Greek or in Russian or whatever. So it's a very uh, Western style language. It sets up a very secular government, one that enforces secularity. We have to remember in the context in the 19th century, it was an increasingly religious oriented society in the Ottoman Empire. This one's now more secular. They literally mandated in the original constitution that it would be a secular state, and it was a very nationalist state. This idea of there are no Turks, there are no Armenians, there are no Kurds, there are no Jews. They're all part of this Turkish state, this Kemalist Turkish state. And it's a very militant kind of representative republic. And I kind of should have put representative republic in quotation marks because it really wasn't a representative republic. Yes, it had a very influential parliament. Yes, it had an elected president. But behind the scenes, the idea was that the military would act as both a guardian of and a watchdog of the government. That if the government tried to stray too far away from the principles of Kemalism, this perfectionism, this secularist Western nationalist state, they would overthrow the government, often in a violent and bloody coup. Uh, since the establishment of the Turkish state, there have been 6 coups that were launched against the government. The most recent one, the one under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, uh, was put down, and it was the only one that was ever really put down. The rest of them were very much successful. The military would step in, unseat the government, fire everybody, imprison them, execute them, whatever, and rewrite the Constitution, and then hold elections again and basically hit the reset button. Uh, Underlying all of that, there is no room in Turkish society to critique the government or the military. You were either for the government or you were put in jail, basically. So it's not a very liberal government. It is a representative republic in name, yes. It is very secular, yes. Very Western looking, economically, politically, rhetorically, sure. But insofar as acknowledging the desires of the people, not really, not very Western looking in that liberal Western democracy kind of sense. So on the surface, we have France and Britain that make a that promise to make modern states out of a Middle East that they're going to divide up and essentially kind of teach each of the people living there how to be a new modern 20th century state. The Turkish state is technically honorable, forward-looking, and very progressive, and basically everyone gets what they want or need. That's on the surface. The reality is there's a lot of unexamined problems. One of the big unexamined problems, and one of the things that will still provoke a rather visceral reaction if you speak to any Turk today, even, is the idea of the Armenian genocide. All right. The Armenian genocide, I'm going to get to in about a minute, but essentially it was an attempted wiping out of ethnic Armenians who lived in the eastern portion of the Ottoman Empire and who were seen as disloyal to the Ottoman state. Now, most Arabs and Jews were already living in the Middle East. They resented this idea that France or Britain was going to come in and start telling people where they could live, how they would be able to represent themselves, what kind of government they would have. And so you get this bubbling up of resistance. There are Jewish and Arab, sometimes both Jewish and Arab groups that are essentially terrorist organizations. They begin to target um, edifices of colonial power. So they target mail rooms, they target railroads, they target military barracks, that sort of thing. They also, unfortunately, begin to target those favored communities. As I mentioned before, the French favored certain Christian sects that were living in Syria and Lebanon. The British did the same in what would later on be known as Iraq. And unfortunately, the people living there who probably felt good that they were being preferred didn't feel terribly good after they were being targeted by these resentful communities. Now, the Turks also don't talk about or acknowledge the atrocities that the Ottoman government um, engaged in during World War I. And I mentioned the Armenian genocide. It is still, I mean, that is a very easy way to get into a fight in Turkey or with Turks to this day. A few years ago, about maybe 6 years ago, 5 years ago, the American government decided to acknowledge that the Armenian genocide actually happened, and the Turks were quite upset, very upset, and even showed up in person to basically chivvy the the American government and chide the American government. It also pushed the Turkish government to begin to look to Russia for military aid and military support in its state. So there is a very deep taboo even today to talk about the Armenian genocide. So what is the Armenian genocide? Well, Armenians were seen as a kind of enemy within. Armenians had much more closer cultural ties to Slavic states, whether rightfully or wrongly in the Turkish state and in Ottoman history, there was this belief that Armenians really just didn't fit in, that they were kind of weird and unusual, and they never really kind of fit the mold. That's not absolutely not true. Armenians, by the hundreds of thousands, volunteered to fight in the Ottoman Empire's armies. They fought with distinction against the Russians, but as the Russians began to win more and more territory, as the Ottoman Empire began to contract more and more, this narrative of these traitorous Armenians began to gain traction. And so in 1915, the Ottoman army oversaw the mass deportation of Armenians through the Syrian deserts. We're talking forced march, no food, no rest, no water. Uh, if you uh, if you fell by the wayside, you would be beaten. You would be summarily executed. Women were raped repeatedly. Children and men were also sexually assaulted during this entire time, all as part of a humiliation campaign, as they were basically death marched through the Syrian desert. The result is, although official totals are very nebulous, an estimation of about 1.5 million people were killed between 1915 and 1916. And left to starve to death on the side of roads. There's these heart-wrenching stories of mothers who leave their crying babies out in the desert, knowing that they will die much quicker than if they kept walking with the baby, that the baby would essentially starve have a much longer and excruciating death than if they were just left out for the wild animals to come along and kill. Um, there's also horrific stories of women who were just repeatedly raped day after day after day after day until they either took their lives or were murdered by their rapists or died of the assault or whatever, and on and on and on. There's these horrible, horrible stories. It's a kind of window into what the future holds for future conflicts. So I have some questions for you. Now, imagine you are a minister for France or Britain in the Middle East. How do you reconcile the competing interests between the Balfour Declaration that we talked about and the Sykes-Picot Agreement that we talked about? Balfour Declaration promising land in what was historically known as Judea to the Jewish people, and yet at the same time you're also promising the same land to Arabs to be an Arab kingdom. Can you change your mind after the war is over? What happens if you change your mind? And what happens if you don't change your mind? Well, you get a fractured and fractious Middle East. That's what happens if you don't change your mind and if you kind of just let the promises die on the vine. And this was referred to as a white paper, just a policy idea, kind of spitballing out there, seeing who would be interested in that. And it was never really, it was said that this was never really an official policy, both the Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration. The reality was that they would both have been implemented if they could have been, but they couldn't. The new state, the Turkish state, emerges from the skeleton, I'm sorry, from the corpse of the Ottoman Empire. They still have some skeletons in the closet. They're very anxious to ignore the Armenian massacre. They're also very keen to put down any internal rebellion, and so they're a very repressive state. France and Britain have influence over the Middle East. They're happily dividing and ruling, and they essentially have a tiger by the tail. Essentially, they're exacerbating the divides within the Middle East, intentionally in some cases and unintentionally in other cases, and they're wondering how long this can last. And so, in the meantime, they're getting as much resources as they possibly can from the Middle East. Good example would be the discovery of oil in Iraq and Iran, and in northern, what would be called later on Saudi Arabia. At the time was called Nejd. Um, it was a big empty peninsula, basically full of Bedouin nomads. So the French and British have a very tricky problem on their hand, and one they're not quite sure how to deal with. There's no coherent policy because everything they try seems to kind of blow up in their face. India, let's move on to that. Now, India as a colony had sent soldiers over to fight in World War I, and they were an integral part in the war against the Ottomans in particular, but also in the Western Front as well. Now, some troops in the Pacific Theater in Singapore and Indonesia had mutinied and refused to go to war on behalf of the English, saying, "We don't owe you anything, we're just here to secure India. What are we doing deploying to these different places?" And the Japanese had to be called in to put down these mutinies, which the Japanese did most handily. Uh, During the Great War and for a time after, martial law was imposed upon India. And I mentioned that before at the beginning of the lecture that this was partly to ensure that England would not lose India. But by tightening their grip, by being so paranoid about losing India as a wholly owned colony of the empire, they may have accelerated the timetable and may have made things worse. During this martial law, there were no civil courts. All crimes were handled by the military, which had a different set of rules, which did not have the civil protections that the Indian National Congress had spent the last several decades wringing from the English Empire. There was no right to a trial, you had no right to a lawyer, and you had no right to assemble or even speak out against the English government. And a perfect encapsulation of this kind of brutal martial law is in the Amritsar massacre. I have a video of this. It's actually a recreation of the events of 1919 in the whole Sikh holy city of Amritsar in India. And it essentially boils down to a group of several thousand Indians had gathered to listen to a speaker talking about passive nonviolent protest to essentially not comply with immoral laws, that flouting immoral laws was a moral imperative. If it is a law that flies in the face of human need, in the face of human freedom, then it must be defied. That's essentially what they were arguing. But they were also arguing for nonviolence. That is important not to lash out against the English. Well, the English, because the gathering place was an enclosed, walled courtyard, the English locked almost all of the exits, came in one of the other exits, and opened fire on the assembled crowd. Now, I say the English. In reality, it was Indian troops that had been hired and transported from other Indian states to Amritsar. So they were kind of deployed, if you will. You can imagine uh, being raised in Florida and being deployed to Alaska, basically. So you're being deployed to Alaska and you're being asked to do something by your commander. You have no ties to these people, and so when he tells you open fire on this group of criminals, you will of course open fire on this group of criminals, and that's exactly what happened. Now, in the Indian view, this event in 1919, referred to as the Amritsar massacre or the Balad Singh massacre in India, proved that the British were bloodthirsty and repressive, that they were unreasonable. They were cold-blooded and calculated murderers who would try their best to maximize casualties in order to humiliate India. And it was proof that England had to go. And the proof that England had to go really kind of, or at least that hardline view, really exacerbated some sectarian divisions. Part of it was caused by England itself, that began to favor more and more the Muslims, seeing them as the more reliable partner in India, which only made things more resentful, more difficult. But it wasn't like the Muslims were not being repressed in their own way. They absolutely were. They faced the same racial discrimination, the same kind of barriers to advancement that non-Muslims faced, largely because of the color of their skin and the place of their birth. Now, in the British view, the Amritsar incident, uh, like that, the Amritsar incident was essentially putting down those people who had defied martial law. And there was this evocation of the Sepoy Mutiny from the 1857, that if the Sepoy Mutiny had been put down earlier, it would have saved thousands of lives. Yes, unfortunately, we had to kill a lot of people in this Amritsar incident, but General Dwyer, the man in charge, had acted honorably. It was a bit embarrassing on the world stage, but you do what needs to be done, essentially. And the proof that India was unable to govern itself is the fact that there's sectarian violence, that you have Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Christians and Jews all at each other's throats. And if it wasn't for England, that entire subcontinent would devolve into internecine warfare. And that England, this was a burden it had to bear. It was a nasty burden. It was a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. That's the English view or British view, largely. So after the atrocities of the British in India, the Indian National Congress, which is mostly Hindu, and the rival Indian Muslim League began to work together. They began to really pressure the English government towards one of three outcomes. First was home rule, one that was really kind of favored more and more by the Indian Muslim League and less by the Indian National Congress. Home rule would be India would be part of a British Empire but ruled by Indians. It would stay within the English Empire. Self-rule was increasingly favored by the Indian National Congress and not so much by the Indian Muslim League. And self-rule meant complete and total independence from Britain. The uh, these competing desires really were some of the evidences of uh, that divide and rule playing out in local politics. For the Muslims, they saw the presence of the British as a necessary check against overwhelming Indian Hindu nationalist fervor, this religious fervor that it should be called Hindustan, not India. Hindustan means that the home of the Hindus. And what does that mean for everybody who's not Hindu? Well, that means you get to be a second-class citizen if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, you get to be attacked, killed, marginalized, and forgotten. And so the Muslim and Hindu divide really begins to play out over these next couple of decades. And there's as much violence within the Indian communities as there is by the British against the Indians. But it just seems more oppressive when the people who are in charge just suddenly walk into a courtyard and start shooting people. That's kind of bad form. So I want you to imagine that it's your family and your friends who are murdered by Britain. So were the Indian National Congress being completely unreasonable? If it was your family, if it was your brother, sister, uncle, cousin, whatever, who got shot in the head by a rifle bullet pulled by the trigger of a soldier in the employ of Britain, would you be what would your reaction be? Would you be inclined to consider keeping them on and allowing India to be part of the British Empire? Do you think that the British would have the best interest at heart of you and your community? Why do you think that, or why don't you think that? And here we come to Satyagraha. Now, Mohandas K. Gandhi, who had trained as a lawyer, he had served as a medic in World War I on behalf of the British. He really begins to become the face of resistance in India. He has some very high ideals, this idea that eventually, just through pure moral rigor and through interest in and love for your neighbor, that eventually the Hindus and the Muslims would see that a united Hindu Muslim India would be a beneficial future. Um, he articulates this idea of nonviolent um non-compliance with the law. Now, he's not the first to do it, he's just the most successful to do it. He is very strategic, very judicious in the laws that he decides to defy and in the ways that in which he defies them. A good example would be boycotts, boycotting purchasing of English textiles. Well, there had been boycotts before in India, but they were very hit and miss. They were boycott all English products, which was kind of almost impossible. It was boycott uh, all all interactions with the English, which again, kind of impossible. His was more strategic. The boycott of, say, English textiles. Yes, that meant that some people didn't have clothes, but he began to teach people, or his followers teach classes where they would teach people how to make their own clothes at home, how to spin their own yarn, how to make their own clothing, how to weave, how to sew, that sort of thing. And so, in a way, it was a teaching them self-reliance as well as boycotting products. And as we mentioned before, about 40% of all the textile output from England was sold in India. So losing that was quite the pinch to the English attempts to recover their economy. He also advocated boycotting taxes. That you don't pay taxes. If the English come and demand money, you just say no, I'm not going to pay it. If one person or a dozen people or 100 people or even 1,000 people did it, they could be jailed. But what if tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or 1 million people did it or tens of millions of people did it? Well, then now you have a problem on a scale that England could not possibly cope with. So at the heart of it, at the heart of his nonviolent confrontation was still a confrontation. He was still breaking the law. It was illegal to evade taxes. It was illegal not to pay your taxes. But he did it in order to provoke a reaction from the British government and to put the British government on the back foot, to basically put them, knock them back a little bit so that you could then negotiate. You have some room to negotiate. He used this satyagraha, this taking of the blows, the taking of the abuse, quite literally, and he used it very strategically as well. He invited foreign correspondents, especially American correspondents, to come over and view the protests and to film them and to report on them. And he did this, it's not so much cynical, but it's rather strategic and rather clever. He was as much a general on the moral battlefield as any of the generals on the Western Front were. So why not fight back if you're being beaten? So if you think about a fight, just think about two people fighting in the street over you don't know what. You just happen to come on a street and you see two people slugging it out. Who, in your view, is the victim? It's hard to tell, isn't it? But if you have two people in the street and one person is just pummeling the living heck out of the other person, and the other person is just protecting their face and telling you, stop, 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 who's the victim? Who are you going to pull off of whom? Person A, who's doing the punching, or person B, who's the victim of the punching? So then, in your view, initial gut reaction, who's the victim in this fight? If somebody's putting their hands up saying, stop, 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 and that's person B, are they the victim? Why do you think that? And then why would you, if you were Gandhi, why would you have newspaper reporters, cameras, film crews walking around and following you? Are you going to get a favorable view in English papers if you're Gandhi? Do you think you'll get favorable views in French papers or Russian papers or in American papers compared to British papers? So finally, why break the law? I mean, can't you get what you need without breaking the law? Can't you just comply with every law and then they'll be granted independence? Then they'll be granted everything that they need if you just be patient and wait long enough? Or is it necessary to break the law? Is it necessary to defy oppression? Well, the upshot is that India is not an easy colony to govern for the British. There's political opposition. There's that coalescing of um, nationalist ideas in the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, what is known as the Lucknow Pact. The Lucknow is a city in India, and the two competing interests agree to work together to coordinate their pressure on the British. Because if you have disparate parties with disparate demands, it's easy to placate one or the other or to play them against each other. If you're unified, if your opposition is unified, it's much, much harder to break them. There's also moral opposition. Gandhi and his advocacy of satyagraha gains a lot of international attention. There are opinion pieces about the vicious repression of the British by the British of the Indians, and if England had been fighting against the anti-democratic central powers, why were they acting in such an anti-democratic way in India? So this builds international opposition. News and film getting out really builds international pressure, which opens a whole new front for England. It makes it increasingly difficult for England to hold the moral high ground, to repress the stories of what's happening. And as British, especially opposition newspapers, start to get stories from like America, Canada, Ireland, Germany, Italy, France, you name it. As soon as these other stories start filtering in, it's easy to debunk this national narrative that the British have really built up. That it was a terrible job, but we had to do it. Well, did you really have to do it? Did you really have to go in and shoot all these people? Or could you have told them to disperse? Could you have arrested them? Could you have arrested a few of them and made examples? Could you have maybe lifted the martial law and allowed them to assemble? Now let's shift all the way over to Japan. We've gone farthest east that we possibly can and still talk about Asia. Now, Japan at the end of World War I had tried to play by the rules of the Western democracies. In Japan, um, there was this belief that the Japanese had proven themselves as just as civilized, just as sophisticated, just as advanced as Europeans and the Americans. Therefore, they should have a seat at the table. Well, in fact, Japan even proposed to that League of Nations that all nations be treated equally, regardless of uh, their racial makeup, for lack of a better term. And in fact, we have an excerpt here of a proposal that was put up by the Japanese delegation to the League of Nations, that the equality of nations being the basic principles of the League, the high contracting parties agree to make no distinction on account of race or nationality. So in other words, all nations can deal equally with each other. I can give you a hint as to how this went, but I think you already know with the League of Nations. Japan was allowed to keep German possessions in China largely because, as I mentioned before, the Europeans were very exhausted and weren't really interested in fighting over those former German territories in Asia. The Japanese were continually being subjected to racial biases, both in diplomacy, being treated as minor powers as opposed to a world-class power, as being treated by like a kind of pseudo colony rather than an independent nation itself. And even though they had proposed in the League of Nations that the all nations be treated equally, that proposal never really gained any traction with the French and British. And of course, the United States wasn't participating, so no traction there as well. In fact, in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, Japan was subjected to quotas of immigration and trade to the United States. The United States would not sell technology or steel or oil to Japan except for limited amounts. And when it came to steel, they couldn't buy brand new, freshly manufactured steel. They could only buy scrap steel. So things that were secondhand. So in other words, like a junkyard, basically. The Japanese democracy was under assault internally. It had been a very democratic, increasingly democratic society into the 1920s, but the military needing to express its Japan's need for resources, or increasingly relied upon Japanese military to acquire those resources, whether putting down rebellions in certain provinces or extending influence through Manchuria. The military played an important role in securing um, coal, oil, steel, copper, aluminum, all these different resources that Japan needed to keep their economy humming along. So increasingly, the military asserted its control over the government, and increasingly, a very slow moving silent coup made Japanese society stridently anti liberal, anti Western, anti democratic. Japan did establish colonies. This isn't World War One is not the end of colonialism. That's not until World War Two, where colonialism really begins to fall apart. But we see it starting to unravel now. So Japan has colonies in Korea, Manchuria, and other places. They need these colonies the same way that those European countries needed colonies. They were markets for Japanese products. They were also places that raw materials could be extracted, as well as the prestige. Japan, this tiny little set of islands, I think it's 4 islands, onto which a a heap of abuse had been lumped, had risen and proven itself to be a world power, challenging places like England and the Netherlands and France and Russia and the United States. So it's a pretty remarkable story. At least that's the narrative that the Japanese told themselves. They begin to expand in the Pacific Islands because navies had, at the beginning of World War One, moved away from steam power and more towards oil-based navies. Oil is a much more efficient carrier of energy than coal and steam were. And so acquiring new sources of oil became increasingly important, especially as the 1920s come to a conclusion and the Great Depression begins to reverberate around the world. Japanese exports begin to fall. A lot of those exports are luxury items, everything from silk to playing cards to whatever. They're not really manufacturing necessities. Even if they were manufacturing necessities, other countries around the world, like the United States and England, had put up trade barriers, massive tariffs on imported products, ostensibly to protect local industries and to revive their own economies. And so they couldn't even export to other countries. So this really jeopardizes Japanese economic stability. So they need to expand in these Pacific Islands. So unfortunately, because of the nature of Japanese economy, they were particularly vulnerable to the booms and busts. In other words, if a boom was happening, and let's say there was a financial market was doing extremely well, a very bullish market, and everybody was doing well, they would buy a lot of silken products. So then there would be a lot of investment in silk or playing cards or machinery or whatever that the Japanese were creating, and those would sell very well, and so you'd have this influx of cash. But then, as soon as the market began to turn south, one of the first manufacturers that would be affected would be Japanese manufacturers, and so they were very prone to busts as well. So Japan began to focus instead of on these small, independent, very laissez-faire, free market capitalist ideas. They began to concentrate power in a more efficient, at least to their view, zaibatsu or monopolies that are allowed to control vast swaths of the Japanese economy, and it does work throughout the 1930s. The zaibatsus, these monopolies, become very cozy with the military exerting increasing influence and eventual control over the government of Japan. And Japan is nursing an old grudge by the 1930s. Increasingly resentful of their treatment at the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese begin to see the rest of the world not as potential partners, but potential rivals or potential aggressors against them. As Hideki Tojo, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, once said, I would point out that Japan had proposed at the Versailles Peace Conference on the principle of racial equality and was rejected by delegates such as those from Britain and the United States. They also re-proposed this in the League of Nations, and had also been rejected. So they've been trying time and time again to get everybody to play nice with each other and not be such racist jerks about it to each other. The working class in Japan is relatively scattered, especially as the Zaibatsu begin to coalesce and increase their influence. They keep the rural people in the rural trades. So if you're a rice farmer, your father was a rice farmer, your grandfather was a rice farmer, your son or your daughter was probably going to be a rice farmer, and your ability to move out of that job was really, really curtailed. If you were a fisherman, if you were a tradesman, if you worked in a factory, didn't matter. You were probably going to be stuck with that one employer. It wasn't like you could just say, well, I'm getting tired of working for this factory. I'm going to go look for another factory. If you decided to shake up the system in that way, you were effectively blackballed. You were not allowed to find another job. And so you could come crawling back to your original employer. And if you were lucky, they might reemploy you at a much lower rate. And so nobody wanted that. Nobody wants to lose money. Nobody wants to be humiliated, that sort of thing, especially not in Japan. And so you have this very scattered working class, this very scattered majority of your population. At the same time, you get this kind of nostalgia that is really fostered by the military for the good old days of the samurai, the warrior class that were the pride of Japan. And the samurai honestly still played a huge role in the literature, in the poems of even modern Japan, even though barely 100 years before, barely 80 years before, there had been this massive civil war that had wiped out the samurai, that the samurai had actually stood in the way of Japanese progress and had wanted to keep Japan uh, uh, less advanced, less capable of defending itself. So it's kind of a revisionist history. It's not the first time nor the last time that you're going to see revisionist history happening when we glorify the past. And so we have this new militarism beginning to arise in Japan. The Great Depression really derailed the Japanese economy. It is way more affected than most of the other countries, especially when we talk about major powers or what would later become the belligerents of World War II. And they're increasingly disillusioned with the West, increasingly disillusioned with democracy. They had tried to exercise their voice at the Treaty of Versailles, tried to exercise their voice at the League of Nations. They had tried and tried and tried, and largely found this to be a hollow promise. That democracy was a hollow promise. So instead, they opt for aggression. And this aggressive expansion was to take back territory that they thought was theirs, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Pacific Islands that were held by the Dutch, by the English, by the Spanish. And the civilian government was relatively weak and subservient to the military. The military begins to run rampant. How bad is that rampancy? Well, it gets really, really bad, especially because in China, which is one of the victims of Japan's expansion, there are competing interests for a national vision. You have the nationalist Chinese, which are ostensibly Western democracy, kind of strongman democracy, for lack of a better term, kind of the way that Turkey is aligned. And you also have communists, which is much more populist, but not as palatable to France and England and the United States as, say, the nationalists were. The nationalists controlled the city centers, while the communists largely had a rural movement. A lot of the people who suffered the most were the rural peasants, and so they attracted a lot of support from the peasants. The nationalists theoretically were anti-warlord, they were anti-fractured government, and they were theoretically anti-foreigner. The reality is that's not true. Rhetorically, they said they tried to root out corruption. They didn't. The nationalist government was very, very corrupt. It was very much a government for hire. If you had a lot of money, it listened to you. If you didn't have very much money, it ignored you or exploited you in some cases. The communists similarly were anti-foreigner and increasingly they were anti-capitalist. That was largely because of the influence of the Soviet Union, which had really bolstered them, which had supplied them with money and weapons and literature and doctors and educators and all that sort of stuff. So on the nationalist stage, you have this idea of land reform, this idea of people being able to uh, own their own businesses, own their own land to basically take away from foreign companies or land or warlords land that had been absconded with and given back to the people. That didn't really happen all that much. What happened was is the nationalists would take land or property or wealth away from people that they didn't like who were powerful and give it to people that they did like who invariably were powerful. So not so much land reform. They were rhetorically very anti-Bolshevik, very, very anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist as it were. The communists, for their part, were very much more uh, honest in their land reform. Lots of times, they also opposed warlords. They also opposed foreigners who had taken land away from local farmers and small villages. And they did actually have a very good track record of giving that land back. Now, were they so good at anti-corruption like they said they were? Not really. Because lots of times the communist government, especially as it began to consolidate power in the countryside, would make deals with warlords so they could stay in place and maybe have a position within the government. Maybe not as much land as they used to, maybe not as much autonomy as they used to, but you know, it's the exigencies of this civil war. So China is locked in a civil war. The nationalists control the cities, the communists control the countryside. They both have really spotty records with dealing with foreigners, with dealing with corruption, and dealing with land. Well, Japan is one of those foreigners that ostensibly both the nationalists and the communists are opposed to. Now, the nationalist Chinese had tried to win the hearts and minds of the Chinese people and had engaged in a fight against the Japanese. Unfortunately, compared to the Japanese military, the nationalist Chinese were woefully under-equipped, woefully undisciplined, and absolutely not ready to fight any serious, sustained uh, campaign against the Japanese. The Japanese, for their part, used this what they saw as unprovoked attack as an excuse to extend their control further into China. The attacks by both the nationalist Chinese and the Japanese, but particularly the Japanese, were critiqued in the League of Nations. They were derided in foreign newspapers as proof of the barbarism of the Japanese. It was proof that the Japanese couldn't be trusted, that they were on the path to conquering the world and establishing their own empire in the Pacific. But for Japan, Japan saw this as proof that they could stand alone. And so they quit the League of Nations. They said, we will not be bound by uh, your, your rules. We will not be bound by negotiations. And this was largely a move by the military to prove the independence of Japan. That Japan was tough enough to handle itself. Well, this all spiraled out of control in the 1930s, and perhaps the most infamous interwar period uh, pogrom that was executed by the Japanese military was the so-called Rape of Nanking, or also known as the Massacre of Nanking. This happened in 1937. There was a confrontation between nationalist Chinese army and the Japanese at a place called the Marco Polo Bridge. The bridge was symbolic as these kind of this halfway point between Japanese controlled and nationalist controlled territory. The nationalists were easily defeated and retreated, and the Japanese, rather than saying, okay, we defeated them, now we're going to go back to administering the city, they decided to punish the people of Nanking. And so they rampaged through the streets. It was a relatively minor incident that provoked a huge massacre. They would hunt down men, women, children, didn't matter, and kill them. Sometimes they killed them en masse, leaving their bodies laying in the streets. Sometimes they piled up decapitated heads. Sometimes they killed mothers, babies in their arms, and then killed the mothers. It was basically wholesale slaughter. This was this bloodthirst, level of bloodthirst that shocked the rest of the world and did nothing to improve the Japanese image overseas. So the upshot for Japan is that we have this kind of pseudo-fascistic military that is in control of Japan. The emperor technically is in charge. There still technically is a representative or parliamentary body, technically, but in reality, the military is calling the shots. The Japanese are acquiring territory that they see as vital to their economy, and the military expansion begets more and more expansion. This glorification of the military, this glorification of the Japanese prowess, and the Japanese natural position on the world stage as a prime mover and a prime colonial power. Japan begins to build up the army and navy, which many in the United States and Britain see as a stepping stone of a war in Japan, in the Pacific against Japan. Now, in 1937 in the United States, or even 1938 or 1939, there was increasingly a belief that there was going to be a war in the Pacific and it would be against Japan. They did not really see Germany and Italy as a threat, absolutely saw Japan as a threat. So what's the conclusion? What are we meant to take away from this? Well, the Middle East, there are lots of people who are upset, especially Muslims, Christians, and Jews. They're upset not just with each other, but with the colonial powers of England and France. France and England are losing their grip on colonies. They're beginning to really find that the Middle East is a bit more trouble than they particularly bargained for, and you see the withdrawal of British and French troops in the Middle East in the lead up to World War II. India is increasingly fed up with this, with the British rule, and they're somewhat, at least on the surface, united in their desire to see England go. India essentially proves that England is losing the higher ground, that they have no mission there, that they are doing nothing but brutalizing people for their own profits. Japan is embracing these quasi-fascist ideals. Don't quite venture into fascist government territory, but they come really close, or they are similar in many respects, and they are increasingly aggressive and angered at their treatment at by the rest of the world, which excuses them, I guess, in their minds to engage in genocide. So we have a Asia that is restive, fractured, and just plain tired of the way that Western societies are treating them. Now, do they react well? Do they react poorly? Well, that's what our interpretation is up for. All right, guys, that is it for this week. We'll see you again next week.